Hey everybody. Um, we were just waiting for a couple of people to get on before we started, but I think we're gonna get going. Welcome. My name is David Katz-Nelson. I'm the CEO of Reboot. I want to start by hoping that everyone here today is safe and healthy, and if not healthy, on the mend. These are such crazy times of uncertainty, loneliness, and sickness. And we know that we are living in a current reality with the tension of wanting to convene together, but not being able to convene together. And our reality is wearing a nice shirt and sweatpants, seeing each other through a lens of a screen and touching with words and eyes and expressions. Today, March 27th, at this moment in time at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard, we were supposed to launch our first ever physical Reboot Ideas Festival. We were going to use the historical spirit of Jewish conversation to expand our current reality. The theme of festival, drawn from the upcoming holiday of Passover, was what plagues us and what liberates us, which seems now more relevant than ever. And that is why we're here today. Over the next months, we're going to need to be together, to reimagine Judaism, to share with one another, and as we will discuss today, to understand both the scientific and medical realities and our spiritual and emotional needs, because we need to be both healthy in body and soul in the upcoming months. We believe our Jewish inheritance is powerful, a source that can be drawn upon to lift us up, to help us understand all these things. And thank you so much for being here with us today. Before we get into it, I have some Zoom instructions I was asked to read. If you have any connection problems during this session, we advise you to move close as you can to a wireless router as possible. Sometimes leaving the meeting and then rejoining will clear everything up. Most of you will see a Q&A tab, a chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. The Q&A is if you have a question for our panelists during the conversation, please use that button to submit your question and we'll add select questions to the queue for our panelists. We have already received a ton of great questions ahead of time. Rabbi Brous and Dr. Agus will do their best to cover as much of this as possible. And the chat function allows you to publicly post messages. Please be aware that everyone in the webinar will be able to see what you write. And now it is my honor to introduce to you Rabbi Sharon Brous, who will take you through the rest of today's program. Sharon is a dear friend who founded IKAR, a groundbreaking religious community based on spirituality and social justice. She is a voice I need to hear regardless of the times we find ourselves in. And I'm so thankful to have her here right now. Sharon, take it away.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you all for being here. I just want to start today by honoring the really extraordinary moment that we're in and all that we're holding as we gather together this morning, even as we marvel at the way that this technology is letting us still see one another and hear one another. I know that we're holding a lot right now. We're holding fear for ourselves and for our loved ones and for our society. We're holding anxiety because we don't know what the future holds. We're holding very deep concern and questions about whether or not this will be a blip and then we'll return to the world as it was, only with a deeper appreciation for human touch and for teachers and for nurses and doctors, or if this radically and permanently transforms the world that we live in. So we've spent the last 2 weeks in a mad race to create a virtual new society, all while trying to manage our own anxiety and fears and deep concern and children. And we've barely had time to consider the magnitude of the disaster that's unfolding around us. For some of us who are still standing at the edge of the abyss and haven't yet fallen in, these early days are busy, but they're also eerie. And some have even described them as a little bit romantic. There are times where we're at home, we're having Zoom happy hours with people we love. There's a shared sense of vulnerability that's helping bring people closer together. In fact, we know that we are really hovering at the edge of vast human suffering and that we are all incredibly vulnerable right now. As of last night, the United States now has the greatest number of cases of coronavirus worldwide, more than 81,000 cases, and I'm sure that number's grown even this morning. If you saw in the New York Times this morning, really important article about an ER in Brooklyn where there have been more than 800 cases in just a couple of weeks. You have to read this article. It's terrifying and astonishing that this is happening in this place in this time. And we know that ahead of us is a haze of grief and loss, loved ones who will lose lost love, lost innocence, lost opportunities, lost wages and job security, lost savings, lost dreams, college graduations, proms, b'nai mitzvah, and it's all really unprecedented as we keep hearing. But several years ago, I became interested in this idea of spatial orientation, which I want to share with you for a moment to lead us into a little bit of learning we're going to do this morning, and then a conversation that we're going to be having with Dr. David Agus, who has been a teacher and a guide and a friend for me and for so many of us during this time. So spatial disorientation is when there's some kind of abrupt change or stimulus that happens internally or externally to pilots or to scuba divers, for example, like a shark. And it causes the diver's perception or direction to no longer accord with reality, so that the diver feels dizzy and confused and starts to suffer from visual illusions. So in a mad attempt to try to get safe, the diver who becomes so disoriented literally is incapable of figuring out which way is up, and more often than not will swim in exactly the wrong direction, putting herself in more imminent danger than she even would have been in. And I say this morning because I believe that the deep state of anxiety and confusion over the past several weeks, almost blurring life before the virus, is leaving many of us feeling unmoored and disoriented in a kind of not spatial disorientation, but spiritual disorientation. And aviation and diving experts tell us that when such a thing happens, that we have to trust our tools, that we don't trust our instincts, but we trust our compass. We trust the tools that are provided on our dashboard or on our equipment. And so today I want for us to explore a little bit some of our tools, the tools of our tradition, Torah, wisdom that's been passed on for thousands of years, because I find myself yearning for a spiritual framework for this time. In an era of misrepresentation and deception and outright lies, I am yearning for a deep truth, for something that comes from the past, deep in the past, that can help all of us make sense of this moment. So we all know now that Passover is coming. Long before the coronavirus, as David said, we planned to get together this morning, and the session was intended to be called What Plagues Us and What Liberates Us, and we had no idea what was to come. We only knew that this conference was to happen in close proximity to the holiday, which was only 2 weeks away. So this morning, in my search for tools, spiritual tools to help us hold this moment, I want to turn in particular to one moment in our liberation story, to two plagues that I believe capture some of what this moment is taking away from us and some of what it also offers us. So after hundreds of years of enslavement and degradation and humiliation, the time had come for the liberation of our ancestors. And we know the story of the 10 plagues. First came the water turning to blood, and then the frogs and the lice and the wild animals and the pestilence and boils, thunderstorm of hail and fire and locusts. And then the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. And the Torah tells us that God said to Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky, that there will be a darkness that will descend on the land, a darkness that can be touched. It says, Vayamash choshech, a darkness that can be touched. This plague feels really strangely out of place. So it's going to be dark for 3 days and 3 nights. And I'm sure that that was inconvenient. We had rolling brownouts here in Los Angeles last night. I'm sure it was uncomfortable, no doubt, but the plagues progressively worsen. And this is the 9th plague, and it doesn't seem exactly as bad as some of the earlier ones were. So we asked, what was so terrible about the plague of darkness? Moses holds out his arm toward the sky, and a thick darkness descends upon all of Egypt for 3 days. And the text tells us that people could not see one another. And for 3 days, no one could get up from where he was. So what's so terrible about the plague? The people could not see each other. but the Hasidic rabbinic voices bring to us a deeper understanding of what was actually happening in that time of darkness. Chiddushei Arim says for 3 days, no one could get up from where he was. This, he says, is the deepest darkness. When a person can't even see his neighbor and therefore can't be with another person in his suffering and pain. When a person no longer feels the pain of his neighbor, he feels like he's impotent, and therefore he sits by another person's pain idly. No one could get up from where he was, the text says, meaning people can't even stand up to help one another. Couldn't be with another person in their time of suffering and pain, which left them feeling impotent and stripped their lives of meaning. I want to acknowledge today that this is part of what is so incredibly painful about what we're experiencing right now. There's so little that we can do. There's a lot that we cannot do, which I hope we'll talk about with Dr. Agus shortly, but there's very little that we can do. And there is a profound and very real human instinct to reach out and to help. And this is precisely now perhaps an act of selfishness to reach out and help somebody who's in danger. So I want to tell you that last week I met for the first time a 90-year-old neighbor of mine whose house backs up to mine, who introduced himself to me as Sergeant. And he was so proud to tell me about his time fighting in the war, especially as an African-American soldier during Jim Crow. And he even took out his credentials out of his wallet to show them to me, which I peered at from a safe 6-foot distance. We kept our social distance, but as we continued to talk, he was getting tired, and so he turned to sit down on his walker. And when we were finished, and each of us was going to return to our own home, he got up and he lost his balance, and he started to fall over. And so, of course, I ran over to catch him as anybody would. And then I realized in that moment that act, which on some level was an act of compassion, could have actually endangered my neighbor's life if I had been exposed to this virus. To not be able to stand with someone in their suffering, this is among the most serious of the plagues. The prospect of our loved ones dying alone because it's unsafe for us to even be by their sides is an unthinkably awful prospect. And this is not some time in the distant future. This is where we are already today around the world. Only a week into our self-isolating, I noticed as we would go for a morning run in the middle of the street in my neighborhood that people wouldn't even look at us anymore on the street, as if you could catch this virus from looking at each other, from saying good morning or smiling to each other. So it's already happening. It's already happening, and we're losing so much because of the fact that we can't help each other. 2 weeks ago on Sunday in the New York Times Magazine, a rebooter named John Mooallem wrote a piece called "This is How You Live When the World Falls Apart," in which he looked at the great Alaska earthquake of 1964, a magnitude of 9.2 that ripped Anchorage apart. And he said that social scientists went up to Anchorage expecting to see violence and looting and manifestations of selfishness and fear and vulnerability. But instead, when they got there, they found resilience and level-headedness and kindness and compassion and cooperation, which over the course of the next many years turned out to be characteristic of disasters everywhere, because it seems that catastrophes tend to bring out the best in people. And there's a reason why that happens, because after devastation, we have a shared impulse, he writes, to come together and care for one another, which produces profound feelings of interconnectedness that help us feel like we are all a part of a shared obligation to work together toward our collective safety. Today, on one level, we're more aware of that interconnectedness than ever before, as this microscopic virus, which is transmitted through invisible droplets, has traversed land and sea and upended the world as we know it. And we are all looking at these interactive maps that show the way the spread of this disease has moved so quickly from Wuhan province, not only to major industrial and urban centers, but also to West Virginia and to rural Texas, has left no part of this world untouched. And yet, we are denied the ability to stand together, to hug and hold each other, to visit grandparents, to stand at the graveside with loved ones. So what plagues us? We are living through a plague of darkness, and it's starker than any other time in our lives. And I lived in New York City on 9/11, and I went to Ground Zero the night after the attacks, and I saw the fire still burning. If being able to pull one another out of the rubble and rebuild the streets in Anchorage made people feel connected, then we have to ask, what will social distancing and isolation and quarantine do to our spirits? And how long before our helplessness moves from wanting to help to feeling impotent, to averting our eyes, to actively seeing the other as competition for limited resources or as collateral damage and therefore expendable in a time of crisis? How quickly will we move from a sense of shared vulnerability to a spirit of scarcity that blinds us to one another's humanity? A thick and deep darkness that can be touched. The terror of the ninth plague is the terror of being alone, of being isolated, invisible, untouchable. And even worse, not only were the people not able to be seen, but they also could no longer see each other, oblivious to each other's pain. They became directionless and impotent and dispirited, and in their purposelessness, their spirits dissolved. And that is what we risk today too. So that's what plagues us. And now the question is, what liberates us? So the story continues with plans for the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Moses stands before Pharaoh and warns, at midnight tonight, every firstborn of Egypt will die, including your own child. And there will be so much anguish throughout the land that you, Pharaoh, will come to me and you will beg me to take my entire people and leave, and I will go. And Pharaoh is furious, and he burns with anger. And Moses departs from Pharaoh's palace. And then just when you expect the horrors of the 10th plague to unfold, that awful night when the children of Israel splash their blood on the doorpost and the angel of death is going to pass over while striking down the firstborn, the Torah interrupts itself in order to tell us about the monthly celebration of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. God tells Moses and Aaron, this will be the mark for you, the beginning of months. This will be the first of the months of the year for you. We're right in the middle of our redemption narrative. We're about to reach the climax. The angel of death is coming. We have a lamb to slaughter. We have to pack. We're about to leave Egypt. And all of a sudden, the text tells us that we are learning about celebrating the new month, because God is telling us to remember that we are moon people, that we are a people that orients our calendars and our hearts to the moon. And in doing so, that way we remember for all time that a new light is always born from the depths of darkness. Before we even get to taste freedom on our way out of Egypt, God says, let me remind you, and let the moon from this point forward remind you and your children of this truth every single month. Now, yesterday was Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the new month, the beginning of Nisan, this season of our liberation. We celebrate Rosh Chodesh every month when two witnesses can look into the dark sky and can see the very first sliver of light in the night. Because there's always a sliver of light that emerges even from the deepest darkness. Two witnesses see the new moon, but then everybody sees the blessing, even the people who can't see the moon themselves, because faith is being called to affirm a light that we sometimes cannot see. And that is precisely what the Israelites do that night. They celebrate the first Seder in Egypt during the plague of the firstborn. They are surrounded by uncertainty. This is before their liberation. The Israelites are holding all of the terror of the death and destruction around them. And they are affirming that there is a light that they cannot yet see. They cast their eyes to the future, to a different, better future, and they let themselves hope. And that changed everything for them. And this year's Seder is going to be a lot like that Seder, surrounded by fear and uncertainty, more aware than ever before of our vulnerability, of the preciousness and the precariousness of life, and celebrating anyway. Because in our disorientation, in the shaking up of our world, our toolkit brings us back to a foundational story of suffering and a story of redemption. It teaches us that in dark days, hope is the antidote to the plague of darkness. There is a recognition that today is not tomorrow, that where we are now is not where we must be. This honors the greatest affirmation of our humanity, our ability to see one another and to allow ourselves to be seen by each other, to honor the innate human capacity to reach out beyond ourselves and bring love and bring light into this time of darkness. The plague of darkness has descended upon us, and we are confronted by incalculable and unprecedented grief and loss. Our superpowers have been stripped from us. My best friend's father died this past Shabbat, and I couldn't give her a hug. And we did Shiva over Zoom, and we can't show up and bring food and cook for each other. This is a strange alternate reality, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But the principles of our Torah and the principles of our faith remain the same. Our challenge is to remember that seeing another person's pain, finding a way to reach across the abyss into another person's heart is precisely what makes us human and what we will need to survive this crisis. So lift your gaze, says our tradition. Look up into the heavens and try to find a sliver of light in the night sky and envision the next chapter when we can again stand together and dream together and build together and cry together and hold one another. An expression of faith is what this will be for some of us, an expression of courage for others. But I believe it's the only way out of the darkness and the only way that we will be able to move from the narrowness, Mitzrayim, to a place of expansive possibilities for all of us. So I thank you all for joining this morning, for reminding ourselves to cast our gaze forward, for holding our fear and even our grief and trauma in this moment. And instead of hiding from one another, looking toward one another with love and with tenderness. And now I'm very pleased to introduce you to my friend, Dr. David Agus. You might know Dr. Agus from his frequent spots on CBS News throughout this pandemic. He's a professor of medicine and engineering at USC Keck School of Medicine and the Viterbi School of Engineering, and he is the founding director and CEO of USC's Lawrence J. Ellison Institute for Transformative Medicine. As a doctor, he specializes in treating patients with advanced cancer. He is one of the world's leading physicians. He is internationally acclaimed for his innovations in medicine and contributions to new technology that are changing the way we understand health. And he also has a very unusual and visionary way of looking at the relationship of the human body to health and disease. You may have read some of his books. All of them are New York Times International bestsellers: The End of Illness, A Short Guide to a Long Life, and The Lucky Years, How to Thrive in the Brave New World of Health. Dr. Agus brings exceptional medical knowledge and experience to every conversation that he enters, and he somehow knows how to warn us without alarming us. In a time in which honesty and transparency are in short order, Dr. Agus is honest, he speaks bluntly, and he speaks with both honesty and compassion. And he and his wife, Amy, are my friends, and they are founders of our community, IKAR, and we're so blessed to have you with us today, Dr. Agus. So thank you so much for taking the time. You are really on the front lines, and it means the world to us to have you with us.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm happy to be. It's a wild time in the world today.
Yes. So I have a number of questions for you that people have written in and expressed that they want to have asked. So we'll have a conversation, and people can continue to write questions into the Q&A bar on the bottom of your screen. So Dr. Agus, we know now that this virus has spread to every country. I understand it has infected more than 450,000 people, and you probably have more accurate and more recent numbers than even that. It has pushed our healthcare systems to the brink. Our hospitals are filling up. It has shut down commerce. Our public spaces are empty and void. We know it's devastating the global economy. One of the big questions that I am holding at the forefront of my thinking today is how this could possibly have happened, because we knew that this was a possibility for years. People like you and others have been warning that a pandemic was inevitable and even overdue. But then the Pandemic Preparedness Office was dissolved a couple of years ago. And now there's this massive, devastating testing failure, and there's lack of access to PPEs, to personal protective equipment. And we're reading about doctors who are wearing the same mask day after day, putting their own lives on the line. There was an Atlantic article yesterday that said, rudderless, blindsided, lethargic, and uncoordinated, America has mishandled the COVID-19 crisis to a substantially worse degree than any health expert had feared. Can you help us understand, how did we get where we are today?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that we were blindsided in many respects. This virus started in December in China. I got involved the second week in January, where I started to FaceTime with a doctor, an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor in China, who had brought it to the attention of the government there, and the government of China basically quieted him. And he would FaceTime me, beginning when we were in Davos in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum. He would show me pictures of what was going on, the devastation. And world health leaders got together and we started talking about ideas, what was happening and how we could respond. And about a week later, he actually passed himself away from the virus. And, you know, it's a global failure. Every country has failed in some regard. Obviously, China, if they had moved aggressively like they had in mid-January, if they had done that a month before, none of us would be in this situation. The United States, certainly we were slow to respond, as are most countries. You know, we don't have, and this is not, it's very hard to blame one administration. It really just goes to our whole system of failure. The CDC has no leadership, and it hasn't for many decades. We failed on Ebola. We failed on many of the other extremes that we had. Our, national stockpiles were empty for the last decade. Because do you want to spend billions of dollars in resources for something that may or may not happen? Or do you want to spend billions of dollars on something that is happening? And that was a question that politicians faced for many years. And they always chose to deal in the here and now, because political cycles are 4 years. Nobody thinks forward. Nobody will get credit for spending billions of dollars 10 years ago for something that happens 10 years from now. And it's a problem that we think about today and not about tomorrow. And I think it's a wake-up call. You know, I see now, I see beauty in this country. I see people stepping up. I get hundreds of thousands of emails a day from doctors, scientists, citizens saying, I'm doing this, or I want to have this idea. I'm working together to 3D print a ventilator. And we see that, and it's beautiful. And, you know, this is an amazing time where we have to think as a community, not an individual. You know, the chance of serious illness from this is very low. 98% of people will get this and the symptoms are mild. 2% have serious symptoms, and probably a tenth of that will die from the disease. So we're all afraid because nobody knows who's going to be in the 2%. Nobody knows who's going to get sick. Certainly we know if you're elderly, dramatically high increase, but we've all seen 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds who have this virus. And so by not knowing, that brings fear. By not knowing, we as a medical community and as a government have to enact large quarantines of the whole population because we can't identify that 2%. And it's very difficult. Obviously, we failed on testing. We're failing on the secondary testing, which is testing who actually was exposed to it. We failed on the implementation of medicines, but we are succeeding on social distancing. I mean, that's the positive, is that the citizens are responding in a very positive way.
Can you talk about, just to help us understand, and we're going to talk medically and spiritually in this conversation. So there are a number of questions that people have asked that move us in both directions. Can you just talk a little bit about the difference of opinion between flattening the curve versus herd immunity? And I know that in your field, there are people who have really different approaches to this, and there's probably wisdom in both, but it feels like you've staked a claim on one of these. Can you share some thoughts about that?
Well, it's not that I've staked a claim. America cannot do herd immunity. Right now, this virus happened in the middle of the flu season. And so our medical infrastructure was taxed. And so if we did, and what herd immunity means, say, hey, listen, tell the 60, 70, 80-year-olds, you guys stay indoors. You men and women stay indoors, and the rest of us without medical conditions go out, and we will all get the virus and we will share it, and then there'll be immunity, so the virus really can't spread among large numbers of people. The problem is that the way our society is set up, is 20-year-olds don't stay away from 70, 80, and 90-year-olds. The way our society is set up is that the medical infrastructure is built to handle a max amount around this time of year, which is when flu season hits. And we all know that there are 40 to 60,000 deaths on average in a year of the flu. And so every incremental case basically cannot be handled by our infrastructure. We don't have the time yet to develop medicines that work. We don't have the time yet to develop the medical infrastructure to be able to deal with the virus. Our hope and prayer is that over the next several weeks, we will have standards on how we treat it and what we call post-exposure prophylaxis. Not the coolest term in the world, but what that means is if you had the flu, I can give your husband a Tamiflu for 10 days and he won't catch it from you. If you had sex with someone with HIV, I can give you pills for a few days and you will not catch HIV. So it's post-exposure prevention prophylaxis. And the hope is we can develop those regimens, both for the first responders and for people who've been exposed of family members. At the same time, we're developing the test where we could say who has been exposed to this virus. 80% of people will have mild to moderate symptoms or no symptoms at all. 20% of people don't even know they have this virus and they've been exposed. And if we do that test, they could be our frontline workers because they have immunity at least for a year or two. And they could be the ones registering in the ER, driving the Uber in the Lyft, working the cashier checkout because there's no risk for them. So the hope is over these next week, we develop that infrastructure, that enterprise in this country. And I think there really is hope that'll happen.
So, this connects to the question that I think has both spiritual and policy and medical implications, which is it feels like in the last couple of days, the talking points of the administration have shifted. There's a kind of hinting toward reversal on social distancing policies in order to protect the economy, a kind of calculation about a willingness to risk illness and risk lives in order to stem economic devastation. It seems like there is a kind of movement toward keeping the people who are most vulnerable at home and calling everybody back out into the churches. The president said he wants the churches packed on Easter Day because he thinks that it will be safe to do so at that time. How does that sound to you I can tell you how that sounds to me as a rabbi. How does that sound to you as a doctor, David?
Well, I think the economy and the virus are inexorably linked. They're not separate. And so if the virus thrives, the economy goes down no matter what. They're not two separate entities that you choose one over the other. I think our president has, an ability of trying to project this is what the future will be and hoping it happens. I trust and believe that the administration will do what's right for the American people and listen to science. And I really hope and believe they will do that. I think we all have to be in a situation now that we actually support the leadership in this country. And I know that sounds weird. Many people are very left-leaning and others, but we all have to act as one. And, our president has an awful, strange way of projecting hope. And this is his way of projecting hope. And I think it's obviously one of his weaknesses is talking about things in this way to really give a true understanding and a true belief in what really is happening. But every week, there's large numbers of scientists getting together, looking at the data and saying, is it safe to do X, Y, or Z? And that will happen. So I don't think we're going to release, and remember, most of these legislations happen at the state level, not the federal level anyway. And I think, we're not going to too soon release the dogs out. And we're not going to let people out of the social distancing if we think it's helping or if it needs to go further. I talk to governors literally, every hour, mayors, and, they're making the rules for their own organizations, for their own cities. There's an amazing video that came out this morning where they looked at a beach in Fort Lauderdale, where there were hundreds of kids who got together for spring break and had a party despite the clampdown and going out of your home in Florida. And then they showed, because they actually traced their cell phones, they show where these kids went when spring break was over. It was over the entire country. So a couple of hundred kids, deciding to have a party actually had the ability of spreading things across the entire United States. And it's an amazing thing to watch how 10 days after this, each one of them was in a different city and had the potential, if they were positive, of spreading things. And there were 20-year-olds, they would not have been majorly symptomatic, and they had a serious possibility. These are what we need to prevent. After 9/11, there were signs. If you see something, tell somebody. we have to do the same. We all have to stand up. And when we see something that is not appropriate, we have to say something.
I'm somewhat astonished by your faith in this administration, I have to say. And I mean, I think what we have seen.
I mean, I think we have to respect the leadership and work with them. I talk to them, the administration, literally every day, and I push them. And I disagree with many things they're saying and doing. But again, to publicly criticize doesn't make sense. But to push them with science and to push them with data and to try to help is the way to make things happen.
So I think part of the reason that people feel such a profound anxiety in this moment is precisely because of the failure of leadership at the top and our strong sense that we cannot trust that the administration will do what is in the best interest of the people, and also doesn't take science and medicine seriously. I mean, we heard on March 6th, he said anybody who wants a test can have a test. That's still not true. 3 weeks later, he's touting drugs that haven't been approved yet. He's encouraging people to go back out. I think that part of the reason for the collective anxiety that we're experiencing is a lack of faith in a strong leadership at the top. This is one of the reasons why I asked you several weeks ago, how can the people get a direct line to you and to what the real science and medicine is? Because I don't think that we can believe what we're hearing in the White House press briefings that are coming out every day.
Listen, I think you're right in many regards. No question about it. That being said, listen, I get up at 2 a.m. every morning and do the morning show, do the evening, just to get information out there and try to talk data-driven science. And at the same time, I'm very conscious. I don't want to criticize the administration, become against. I want to work with and to encourage. And I think you have to have that attitude, especially with this administration, is I want them to listen to me. I want them, when I call, is that I can start to present data in a way, because in order to get normative behavior change, you need leadership. And leadership comes in many different flavors in our country. It may be a mayor, it may be a governor, it may be a religious leader, it may be you, and it's all different. And I think we need to have that leadership to each different group within our country. Yesterday, I was talking to the Hispanic caucus, and they were worried because there weren't anybody reaching out in Spanish to a good portion of our country. And how do we deal with information to that culture? We're talking to mayors, some of whom are doing scare tactics, which I don't think are right, and not necessarily explaining, but just scaring. Each of them, we need to start to build with them structure of data on which to have that leadership. When people don't know what's coming, there's fear. So the challenge is to be transparent and honest with what could happen, what is likely to happen, and what are the extremes. And then in many senses, shoulders come down because they know what to expect.
Can you talk a little bit about, are you comfortable talking about the connection between climate change, between this increase in extreme weather events and the spread of infectious disease and pandemic? Because I know that there have been scientists over the course of the past decade or 2 decades who have been warning that the warming of the globe will lead to more dangerous scenarios like the one that we're experiencing. I wonder if that's something you feel comfortable addressing.
Well, I think we have to be careful, right? I mean, the plague happened in 1918. There was an influenza outbreak similar to the one today that even without air travel ended up killing 70 to 80 million people, called the Spanish flu. And by the way, the Spanish flu started in Kansas and not Spain. It was World War I, and the media in the United States weren't allowed to talk about weaknesses. And the Spanish media talked about it. So there's no question, climate change dramatically affects what are the organisms living on the earth and pushes them in different directions. The bacteria of today are not the bacteria of yesterday. This particular outbreak, I don't think we can actually blame, necessarily on climate change. We can certainly blame it on human expansion, right? We are expanding into the territories of many other species. We are expanding into the territories that we didn't have before, whether they be bats, which are large carriers of rodents or large carriers of viruses. And then for whatever culture eats those, and during the preparation, it's aerosolized, they breathe it in, and they change. Over 5 million years, our genome changed 1%. In one day, this virus's genome changes 1%. So you're talking about a dynamic organism that can change and adapt it to live within us. Climate change has many impacts on the earth that are profound and important, and we have to talk about and we have to deal with. This, though, I think is the virus. You know, Josh Lederberg was one of the greatest scientists of the last 100 years, said the only thing the human dominance on Earth needs to field is the virus. It is our wits versus their genome.
David, can you talk a little bit about how you balance optimism and a sense of hope with really your deep understanding of how profound the crisis is and where it will go? And I just want to say that we know now that in Spain and in Italy, doctors are rationing care to patients who they think are most likely to survive. And from what we're reading about Brooklyn, it feels like we're not far from that here in the United States. How do you personally hold your awareness of how serious this is and how serious it will get in the coming weeks, and also your sense that that we shall overcome?
You know, really, it's really important to realize that there's not right and wrong, and there aren't two sides of this. There's not the left and the right. I disagree with a lot of scientists on what's going on here, right? Many scientists are saying, let's do controlled randomized trials and let's figure out what drugs work and then we'll implement them. And I look at this and go, that makes no sense to me. I don't have 3, 4, 5 months to wait for those results. We're at war now. I'm willing to take risk, and so is every patient who has this horrible virus willing to take a risk. So for example, we built over the last couple of weeks a system where every doctor in the country and around the world, when they have a patient to put on a drug, they can enter the data in and see what happens in this real-time, real-world experience database. Many scientists disagree, but we all have to realize that, again, there are many answers, not just one answer. I see glimmers of hope in the medicines out there. I don't know definitively they're working, but I've seen viral loads go down dramatically with some of these medicines, and using them early matters. The earlier you treat with this virus, the better the outcome. This is a weird virus, different than others, because classically, for example, when you get the flu, you have symptoms and viral load goes up, and then it will go down as your immune system comes in. This time, the day you present with symptoms, that's your highest viral load, which means probably the days before, when you were asymptomatic, you had the ability of being infectious and to spread. This insidious virus can spread when you feel normal and when you feel fine. That's probably why it's spreading so fast and so quickly in this regard. But I've seen a change in our attitude in our country over the last week that is unparalleled. I mean, we're all doing what we're told to do. We are all, staying in and social distancing. The problem is there's a 2 to 9 day incubation period. Then there's about a 10 to 14 day period when you're sick. So when you make these changes, the results don't happen till several weeks later. So it's not going to be till probably the end of the coming week or the end of next weekend till we actually see the curve starting to flat and then go down. And it's very hard, right, when there's not an immediate feedback loop. It's very hard when we make these radical changes in our life and we don't see changes right away, but that will happen. And yes, you could talk about the Elmhurst Hospital in Queens and how it truly is a war zone and they don't have all the facilities they need. Medicine is regional and geographic. Most hospitals, though, are prepared for this and they've built out the infrastructure. You drive by Cedars-Sinai, you'll see a tent, and it is the most efficient operation you've ever seen here in Los Angeles, where people go in with symptoms and everybody else goes right to the ER. These go into this tent and they're triaging and they're looking and they're checking the oxygen and doing the x-ray. And if you're okay, you go home. And if not, you go into the hospital and they do the test. So we are building this infrastructure, and it amazes me how individuals have stepped up, organizations have stepped up, not necessarily the federal government, but individual organizations have stepped up in an amazing positive way and done it. And how you see in cities, they built the infrastructure. So people are leaving food on the doorstops of the elderly so they don't have to leave their home, because they're the ones at risk. They're the ones who will and could die and are going to die from this disorder if they catch it. And to me, that part is beautiful, that we're thinking as a community.
Yeah, I mean, there's extraordinary efforts, and just on the reboot list over the course of the last week or two, there've been, I would say, dozens of emails from people who have access to masks and want to figure out how to get equipment to people. And it's really, I think it's really extraordinary to see the way that people are stepping up in this moment. Can you give us your best projection of what you think the course is that this will take? Are we talking a few months, or are we talking 18 months? What does this look like?
A lot of it depends on where you are and how you're looking at this. There's no question that over the next 6 to 10 weeks, we're going to see a dramatic decline in the panic level and what's going on. And we're going to see more normalization of our behavior. Once we have a post-exposure test that can determine who is safe to go out and can't spread it, can't harbor it, then I think we're going to have some change here. We will see second, third waves of this. Remember, all of the doom and gloom forecasts, 40% of the globe, that's over 3 years. And all of those doom and gloom forecasts are without social distancing, without medications, without vaccines, all of which are happening or going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. So we can rule out those scenarios in that regard. And, you know, we have to look at this in different ways. You know, in Korea, they've had a dramatic and really amazing response, but they don't use privacy the same day we do, right? In Korea, if you're positive, Sharon, a text will go out to everybody around you and say, Sharon in apartment 3B is positive. And everybody knows to stay away from you for the period until you're negative. Your cell phone can be red while you're positive, and when it's felt you're safe, it could turn green. And we've given up, and they're doing that in Israel now. You're giving up the ability for privacy in order to protect the community. We still have problems with that. And every effort that's had now that has any way on impinging on privacy, people are jumping up and getting down, and politicians are afraid of it. Again, I think we need leadership there to say what's best for the community as a whole, not necessarily only for the individual in order to have the best outcome. But I do think over the next 6-8 weeks, we're going to have a lessening of the self-distancing we have, social distancing we have now. We're going to see a lessening of some of the things we have, and we're going to see hybrids of things where certain groups are going to be asked to stay in their homes, the elderly and others. We're going to ask, you know, certain kids may be able to return to school, but not all of them. There may be different responses depending on where you are and what the risk groups are and the location you're in.
I want to just go back to this for a moment because I keep thinking about what you said at the beginning of our conversation about how you fundamentally have faith in the administration, that it will do what's right for the people, and also that it will do what is scientifically and medically.
I have faith that, you know, if scientists and others talk to the administration, have a discourse over time, the right thing is going to happen. I don't think the administration on its own would do the right thing right now, but I do think that there's a lot of discourse with scientists, with doctors and others out there, with members of the administration, and you know, it will iterate over time to do the right thing. It has to.
I really hope that you're right, and I also am glad that you're speaking with them, and I want you to be able to be in continued conversation with them and hope that they will listen to you. I mean, my honest concern about this is that we are dealing with an unprecedented pandemic and also with an unprecedented administration who has shown us over the course of the last several years a complete disregard for the truth that is really governed by mendacity and by a disregard for science. And I think that kind of administration in this kind of moment is what makes us so profoundly vulnerable. And we can certainly celebrate the 3D printing of masks, and individual rebooters are going out and sewing their own hospital gowns and donating them. But it feels to me like if this is going to be addressed, it has to come from really smart policy that's happening at the top, including the right kind of funding and the right kind of and the right kind of health policy decisions that are being made.
Right, but we have to be very careful. I mean, the media and many organizations, when I said publicly that I was talking to the administration, I got hate mail like you wouldn't believe. I mean, I got tens of thousands of emails, threats. How dare you? I mean, so when a scientist talks to the administration, they get threatened. That's not right, right? I mean, so we have to take a step back, and we have to, you know, people are afraid of talking to the administration because what will happen with them if they're associated with it, and that's not right either. That's not right either. I mean, listen, I chair the Biden Cancer Initiative. So I don't care what administration is. I want to help anybody in there to do the right thing. And you can't be vilified for doing so. And that's what we're doing now in our country. As soon as you have a conversation with the administration, you're one of them and you're evil. We can't do that. We have to enable people to have those conversations and not be ostracized, because those conversations are what will bring about change.
So, I know our time is short. I just noticed that we have to close in 4 minutes, and so I want to ask you, and David, I know you're literally saving lives right now. So again, I'm just so grateful to you for taking the time, and this is a conversation I would love to continue with you. So just let me close by asking you this
on the board.
question.
Dr. Agus is pro-administration. See, again, to me, that is rude and inappropriate that people are posting that now. I am not pro-administration, and even if you would say that, this is the problem. You are not pro or con, right? We have to work with it. That is the leadership in our country now. I mean, come on, grow up, people.
I think that we have a real fear that is rooted in what we've seen over the last several years from this administration. And so I don't want anybody attacking you or any other scientist or doctor who's trying hard to work to bring this administration to where it needs to go. But I think that what people are responding to is an incredible vulnerability that we feel, because it seems to many of us that we have an administration that doesn't care about human life. And that's incredibly dangerous and scary. So again, I don't think it's right. And I, as a person who's been on the receiving end of a lot of that hate mail and death threats too, I think it's absolutely inexcusable. But I
don't care about it for me. I don't get intimidated by it. But what it does intimidate is many scientists, many leaders, many researchers and physicians from talking to the administration. They're afraid of it, right? I'm over that. I deal with death every day with cancer. I've got no fear of people criticizing me. But it does criticize many of the people you want talking from the administration to do that. And we can't do that. We have to empower them, not scare them and threaten them.
I hear that approach, and I think that we all have to take the high road right now, and we have to lead with the very best of us. As I started with earlier, and the question of what plagues us and what liberates us, what plagues us is this sense of profound darkness in which we can't even see each other. And I think that what liberates us is being able to look toward a more hopeful toward a more hopeful future together. We're not going to get there by fighting each other. I just desperately want the kind of responsible leadership that you are also saying that you want, and that we've seen among some of the local leaders. We're in a catastrophic moment right now, and I think that we're all going to have to lead with the best of us if we're going to find a way out of this. Somebody wrote that she's been rocked off her spiritual center by the cognitive dissonance of this moment. And a number of the questions that have come in are about Passover and about what it means to hold this moment in 2 weeks at our table. And so I know that there's a lot for us to talk about here with regards to our posture toward this administration and their responsibility for this. But I actually want to close by asking you about Passover, and asking you how you're going to hold this conversation at your table with your family in 2 weeks. How do you bring the lessons of what we're learning today into dialogue with what our tradition calls us to hold in this season of our liberation and redemption?
You know, it's an amazing time, right, where the heroes are the Lyft drivers, are the sanitation workers, are the people who are cleaning the ERs in the hospitals. They're our first responders. They're our heroes. It's not, it's a different world than it ever has been. And I love that, where every person in today's world has a chance to be a hero, and they're stepping up, and it really is beautiful. And so we're seeing that, no matter who you are, if you're the smartest or the wealthiest, or if you're uneducated, or if you're the poorest, you can be a hero and you can help others. And to me, that's the glimmer of hope that really keeps me going. When I walked, to the hospital to see patients the other day, I walked by cars of literally dozens of doctors sleeping in their cars because they couldn't go home. They were afraid that they had been exposed, and if they go home, they would expose their children, their spouse, their neighbors. And so they've been sleeping in their cars for sometimes weeks at a time. And, I see that all they want to do is help. And they know they're going to be positive. That nurse knows that she or he is going to be positive over time, and there's a risk to themselves and to others, but they're going out and doing it, and it lifts the human spirit. And it's, to me, it's, the humans, we're a resilient creature. We have always been here, and we will always be there. We humans are amazingly resilient. And it's experience like this that if we learn from and build on, we have a better world.
Thank you, and it makes me think about this question that I led off with. Is this just a blip, and we'll go back to the world as it was in America in January or February, or is this something that changes us forever? And I believe that this changes us forever. I believe that on some very profound level, we are witnessing the end of a world, and we are going to have the opportunity to build a new world. And I really hope and I pray that the new world that we build is one that is science-driven, that is rooted in respect for medicine, that recognizes and lifts up and honors those who are on the front lines, these healthcare workers, doctors like you, and these heroic nurses and medical care workers, and the folks who are going into the grocery stores and stocking the shelves so that we have food to eat. I hope that in the new world that we build, we understand that paid sick leave is a human right, and not only in a time of pandemic, but all the time. I hope that the new world we build is driven by love and by justice and by equity and by equality, all of the things that we're learning now about the societal breakdown. I think we'll have an opportunity to build a new world that is actually structured on the foundation of those very principles. So I am really grateful to you for doing what you do, and I hope we'll be able to continue to be in conversation. In a moment, I'm going to turn this back to our fearless leader, David Katz-Nelson, but I just wanted to share with all of you as we close the words of Reverend Lynn Unger, which some of you, or many of you, I imagine, have seen in the course of the past week, a poem that she wrote about 2 weeks ago called Pandemic, which is really moving for me and I'm holding very close in these days, and I think especially relevant for us as we go into Shabbat today. So here's what she says. What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling, give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has come clear. Do not reach out your hands, reach out your hearts, reach out your words, reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Sameach, and please be healthy and safe. Thank you, Dr. Agus, and turning it back to David now.
Thank you, Sharon. Shabbat Shalom. You're amazing.
Hi, everybody. Wow. I want to thank Rabbi Brous and Dr. Agus. These are necessary conversations to have. And I want to highlight what Rabbi Brous said about we are all in this together. And to Dr. Agus, we canceled our Ideas Festival earlier than most, partially because of the advice we got from you at that time. And so I want to thank you for your medical wisdom and ongoing work. And Rabbi Brous for hitting the core of what we're dealing with as humans. Reboot will be hosting more calls in the upcoming weeks like this one, and you can find out about them through our Facebook page and our website, rebooters.net. As we approach the Sabbath, a time we're all called to rest, I want to send out thoughts to the doctors, the food providers, the politicians, to janitors, to everyone whose daily work is necessary for all of us, and to everyone, good Shabbos.